I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. Welcome to another episode of Women's Health Unplugged. I have my good friend and colleague, Dr. Erin Ley, back with us today. Pretty soon since the last time you and I sat down together, Erin, to do a podcast. But I will say that muscle and protein podcast that we did maybe is one of the most listened to podcasts in the last 6 months. And it's ones that time and time again, my patients keep coming back and referencing as something that they've listened to, and it's totally changed their relationship with protein. I'm so happy that we're having this conversation again.
I'm back. Can't get rid of me.
We're back, and we are again Zooming from two different rooms in the same building, a la COVID. But today we're talking about something completely different. And it's interesting because I asked you what you wanted to spend some time on and focus on and do some creation for our patient base and you picked teens, which that was not what I was expecting you to say when I said you design something for us. You picked teens. So walk us through why teen menstrual health is something that's so important to you.
So our women's health group, the Wild Collective, we spend the first 2 of 10 sessions talking about menstrual cycles and going through a woman who has regular menstruation through perimenopause, through menopause. And then we also spend an entire session talking about our anatomy. And I was just blown away by how little menstruators know about menstrual cycles and their genital anatomy. I was astonished. And then on reflection, I was like, oh no, that sounds about right. Because when I was a young person and not necessarily in a science physiology based career, I didn't know what was going on either. And these women who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s, who are in our Wild Collective groups, just kept coming back to I need to share this with my daughter, with my teen menstruator, with my preteen. This is information that I wish I had. And it took me the third running of the Wild Collective to be light bulb, light bulb. Why don't we gear information and the conversation towards our young menstruators who maybe even haven't had their first menstrual cycle yet? So it just really started from the lack of education to our 30 to 50-year-olds, and knowing that mothers tend to be the number one place where young menstruators go for information. So let's educate either the mums, but if the mums aren't feeling educated, let's go right to those 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13-year-olds.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I had the same experience. And I think it wasn't until we had both done the Wild Collective session that was on female anatomy. And I was like, did your women know what vulva looked like? And you're like, no. And I was like, my also didn't know what vulva looked like. And so for those of you who have not been through our women's health program, that we go through sort of this, what a very normal, typical female genitalia looks like. We talk about all the realms of normal when it comes to female physiology, menstrual cycles, etc. And when I went through those images for my women, they put up their hand on Zoom and we're like, are all of those normal? And it really sort of reminded me that if they didn't know that all of those things were normal, what did they think about themselves, right? They must have had no clue. And here they had been 40 years living in the same body and they didn't know if their anatomy was normal.
Mm-hmm. Totally. It's your labia minora can go lower than your labia majora. Like, excuse me. Also, what's a labia minora?
Right, right.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So even like the correct labeling, they didn't know. They didn't know
Mhm.
the position of their bladder against their vagina. They didn't know any of these pieces. And, it's not that surprising actually, because we do this education with women one on one all the time. But if we want to have that greater impact in women in menstrual health in general, we need to be having that conversation a lot earlier. The other thing that I think is so valuable here is how many symptoms start to show up in the teen years that can easily go undiagnosed if the parent or caregiver and the physician are not all on the same page for what is considered normal. We know this with endometriosis when we look at menstrual cramps, that we need to be mindful that teens may live through their cramps, or moms may normalize their cramps and say, well, I had cramps too, when really we should be educating more about what falls within that realm of healthy so that they know when they're starting to walk outside that.
Mhm. Yeah. And I do think that looking at what a typical experience is and knowing how to track what the experience is, so we can look at, okay, well, the typical new menstruator may experience XYZ, but this is the trajectory over the subsequent 5 years. Are we hitting those milestones? Are we getting a more regular menstrual cycle after having it for a year? And taking mom's experience out of the picture, because I do think mom, or like whoever, like the female guardian is, we can implant our experience onto our young menstruator, just taking what our experience was as the norm and just being like, this is what's going to happen to you. And that's not an appropriate way to prep our young people for it. Because if you had like terrible menstrual cramps and you're telling your 7-year-old, oh, just you wait, like, is that how we want to have an introduction into period health? Or do we want to say, let's talk about your pain experience. Is it stopping you from playing sports? Do you need pain medication? How much pain medication? And just having an open conversation so we can know what the picture is, if it's changing, if it's getting worse, instead of just being like, well, you got your period, you're going to have cramps.
Sucks to be
That's
a
not,
woman.
sucks to be you, right?
Yep.
Mom went through it, you're going to go through it. And that's not how we should be approaching menstrual health of young people. That's missing the boat.
Completely. And I think we can strive for not just better than the previous generation, but like a hell of a lot better than the previous generation. I think that's what needs to be the target. I even remember when I got my period that my mom was like, well, when I got my period, no one had ever talked to me about it. And I thought I was dying. And so we're going to have like 5-minute conversation about it. And that was like miles better than what her
Yeah.
experience was. But I don't
Mhm.
think we should hold that as the gold standard. Um, and I think that that's kind of the goal, right? Is that we want the future generation coming up to excel, to jump over all of us as far as their understanding of women's health and physiology. Maybe not repeat some of the, I'll say in air quotes, mistakes that we've made previous generations, where we maybe slap the oral contraceptive pill onto many, many female or hormonal problems. So walk us through like what should parents be having conversations about with their young menstruator? Like what should they be knowing before they go into this conversation with them?
Yeah. I think starting the conversation earlier than you anticipate you need to have the conversation is ideal. Like painting the landscape of what a period is before the first period actually improves young menstruators' experience with having a menstrual cycle. And we know those formative years around first period can actually shape and transform your views on your menstrual cycle for years to come. So, really setting the stage earlier than anticipated. If you're like waiting to have the talk with young menstruator for when they get their first period, I think we should rewind and like go even earlier, right? Like you don't need to wait until they have their first period to be like, let's start learning about what this is, right? Like we can start talking about it sooner. And even like I would say, I think it would be important to talk about it before first period. And some first periods are as early as 8 or 9 years. So talking about it sooner than you think is important, step one.
And
You
is the
might hear,
research there, sorry to interrupt you, Erin, is the
yeah, no,
research there that like that shapes their experience, as in the way that we approach that conversation will change their outlook and the way they experience their period, like we see in like older women or older menstruators, where if they feel like their period is terrible, they actually experience it more terribly than if they
yeah.
see it as a vital sign and they see it as something more positive. Is that what you mean?
hmm Their outlook on their menstrual cycle. So even like why it's there, the importance of it, looking at it without a thought of shame or this is a nuisance. And when you think of something in that light, your experience of it is going to be crappier. That's the medical term. More crappy. And it shapes that experience and that outlook for potentially years to come. And it's all about, they've, deduced that it's about feeling prepared, that preparedness sensation of you not getting your first bleed and not knowing what it is and thinking that you're dying, right? That's not you being prepared. And of course, the definition of preparedness is changing all over. But I think the conversation about it, knowing what a period is, knowing that it's not just about like buying pads and tampons, there's got to be more to period education than this is a pad and this is a tampon.
Mhm.
I feel like I'm really excited about this and I don't remember what your original question was.
I asked like what parents need to
Oh, what
know,
parents
or
need
like
to know.
if you wanted to educate the parents around the
Right.
value of why this is an important conversation. Like what do we know in the research around why this is an important conversation to have with
Yeah.
teens? So you answered it, even though
Oh,
you
good.
forgot what the question was.
Oh, good. But I do like, for parents, starting the conversation earlier, preparing the preteen with like proper language, names of proper body parts, names of hormones, and not using your experience as a template for your young menstruators' experience. And this, I don't know if this is confusing, but we should probably clarify. I'm using the term menstruator instead of daughter or girl or woman, because I think the use of pronouns is important, because women don't menstruate, people menstruate, right? And I think that especially when you're going through like formative years, and if you have a child who's not gender conforming or non binary or trans, the idea of saying like your period is what makes you a woman can be quite isolating and to an already very confusing, seemingly isolating time. So we use the term menstruate as opposed to, and I catch myself sometimes, of course, like accidentally saying your daughter or you're like a girl, but technically we're talking about menstruators. And I think that's an important thing to zoom out on and try to look for resources that are very inclusive, because of course you can have a trans kid that menstruates but does not identify as girl, woman, she, her. So if you're confused by the term menstruator, that's why we're saying the term menstruator.
Mhm. And I think that's, and you've created some resources for parents, which we will get to as we go through. I think even that, attention to that detail actually speaks volumes to the attention to all the details that you've put in these resources for parents. Like, I actually don't think you've left no stone unturned, including how accessible the information is to parents for all young people who may be experiencing a menstrual cycle. I mean, also, I think the conversation probably should be opened up to discuss these things with all young teens, right? Like with all teens, imagine what would happen if male identifying kids also understood what was going on as far as menstrual health goes.
Totally. I think when I did sex education as a young person, the boys and the girls were separated, which is like, of course, there's this like societal concept of period shame. It's like boys can't even hear the term period without what their heads exploding. Like why is this a thing? So I love that for sure.
And
So
so
good.
when we're talking about that sort of like healthy teen experience when it comes to menstruation, you alluded to a couple points earlier there that like things might be a bit irregular at the beginning, but we want to see teens moving on some kind of trajectory. Like how can parents and teens reflect on their current experience to know whether or not they need more resources or need more support? I mean, beyond them maybe like having no clue about what we were talking about or what we're talking about. Obviously, then they need a little bit more support. But what are some signs to look for that might give them an indication that things do need, some more attention or maybe the support of a practitioner?
hmm So, when young people first get a menstrual cycle, it can be typical to have cycle lengths between 21 and 45 days. So, that's from day one of first cycle to day one of the next cycle. But there's a lot of irregularity between a person's first period and a person's second period. So, some young people will go 60, 90 days between their first and their second cycle. And then it starts to, have a regular cadence after that. And then some people between their first period and their second period, it's 20 days. So there's a lot of variability between first and second ever period, right? But we know that as a preteen gets more periods and more cycles under their belt, that range between 21 and 45 days can start to tighten and get shorter. And the average cycle length after 1 year of having a cycle is 32 days. So we should be starting to see a bit more regularity after 12 months of having a cycle. And I like to say that after a year or two of being a menstruator, if you're not falling in those parameters of like between 21 and 35 days after 1 year, that's a good time to start to discover any underlying issues, especially if there's other concerns. Like we talk a lot about what a typical teen experiences with acne, right? If there's acne that's very deep and cystic and painful, it doesn't respond to regular face washing or gentle topical treatments, then that might be something that points us in a direction in terms of hormonal health is acne severity as well. So tracking what's going on with your cycle length is important to see if we're seeing more regularity with more cycles.
Right. And there's a good way to kind of describe that. And this is usually how I describe it. Like when that initial, so your brain actually is where your cycle kind of is originated from, which many people don't know that like all the hormones that are linked to initiating and then controlling your menstrual cycle from then on out actually are initiated in your brain. And that sort of brain to ovary axis at the beginning is a little bit immature, right? For lack of a better word. And it's not in that regular pattern. And so that you may end up sort of experiencing these irregular cycles. But we also, I think what you're saying there is have to be on alert that if things don't start to regulate or right themselves, then that would maybe give us the an idea that we're not moving in kind of the right direction. And there may be other hormonal imbalances that are getting in the way of that brain to ovary connection. Sort of polycystic ovarian syndrome is what you're kind of alluding to there, right? With the, unresponding acne and irregular cycles. What about sports? Like, let's talk about the sport thing. Partly I want to talk about like the cramps in sports because we often with teens use that as their metric for whether or not they're having a terrible cycle or whether or not they're having a good cycle is based on whether or not they're able to go to soccer.
Mhm.
Can you kind of walk us through that a little bit or sort of describe what we need to be looking for as far as cramps go?
Yeah, so the experience with cramps is absolutely like I think we can I don't know, does everyone remember like those times where we thought that this was like we weren't going to make it? With our cramps as a young person, it was like, not going to make it. This isn't good. So it's absolutely like 100% cramps are tough as young people, but we do know that sadly, young people are dropping out of sport activity, missing school because of the intensity and severity of their menstrual cramps. Um, and I think, like, for sure, the intensity of cramps tends to taper off after adolescence. Like, once your menstrual cycle, as you talked about, Jordan, like that connection between brain and ovaries has matured. And moderate pain is common for like the 2 to 3 years after first period and seems to get better after age 20. But absolutely, like, this needs to be documented and talked about with your medical care provider. Like, I always say, like, you need to be tracking. If you're using pain medication, you need to be tracking it because this is something that's commonly overlooked, and our threshold for what's normal has been quite high. Like, it's normal you taking like 10 ibuprofen a cycle to manage your pain. Like, that's not appropriate. So you might have something else going on instead of like standard cramps. And female pain is often overlooked compared to like male presenting pain. So we do need to advocate quite strongly for ourselves just by being like presenting female, which is crap.
Yeah, it is. And it's the thing that I find so interesting about menstrual cramps for teens is that how many sort of stereotypical teen behaviors have actually been shown to worsen menstrual cramps. And it's partly why
Mhm.
I think having this conversation is so important. Cramps are built from lots of things, right? Just a lot of inflammation. There's some major blood pressure changes in your uterus as you shed that uterine lining, which is supposed to happen, but at the beginning, that's can be experienced quite painfully. And so much about the teen diet and the teen life can influence their experience of menstrual cramps. We know that skipping breakfast increases menstrual cramps. We know that dieting behaviors in teens increases their experience of menstrual cramps. Eating ultra processed food, or we call it hyper palatable food in
Mhm.
science, actually increases menstrual cramps. And partly when we look at the
Caffeine, all
diet,
that good stuff.
what were
Yeah.
you going to say?
I said, and caffeine
And
too. I'm just
caffeine.
thinking about me in high
I thought you
school.
said and poutine. And I was like,
Oh,
let's
yeah, that
leave
too.
poutine out of it. I feel
Poutine and caffeine. That was my high school
that was my
experience.
high
Yeah,
school.
that makes sense.
Exactly. Thursdays were a good day at Aldershot High School.
I was going to say Nelson High for sure.
So, but like so many of those teen dieting behaviors. So there's the one side of it where it's like the dieting behaviors, we're skipping meals, really skimping on nutrition. And the other side of it is overfueling with those hyperpalatable foods. The net result is they don't eat the like healthy fats in their diet. They don't eat the fruits and vegetables and the antioxidants. And so having this conversation about the impact that your health can have on your menstrual health, like, I think is like completely crucial to building healthy menstruators as they get older.
hmm Yeah, my conversation with young people in the office is very much so around nutrition because there's like no education on nutrition. I was like, do you learn about what like protein is? Do you learn about what fat is, carbs are? And not to like look at this in like a restrictive way that we need to be hyper focused on food, but you should know what happens when you eat jelly beans versus what happens when you eat an apple and peanut butter, right? Like, and the difference between the two and what's an example of an anti inflammatory fat and what inflammation is. And did you know that inflammation in your uterus is causing pain and cramps? And when we lower inflammation, we lower the experience of pain. Like these conversations, like our young people can handle those conversations. They're
Mm-hmm.
smart. They can handle that. And for sure, the like skipping breakfast and crash dieting, like even if you skip breakfast and make the calories up later in the day, that still sets the stage for menstrual cramps. And so many of our young people are walking out the door without breakfast.
Mm-hmm. I know.
Mhm.
So I love that you're pointing parents and teens towards those resources. You're so right that they can handle that information, right? I think we tiptoe around talking about nutrition with our teens because we assume that they're too pecky or too stubborn to make the changes. I'm just not sure we've ever connected those dots for them in a reasonable, logical way. So why would they stop eating the poutine and caffeine if we never really gave them a hard answer for why it matters, right?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
so much of the way we perceive health is around body shape and size. And a teen who runs around all day, you may not see the impact of the poutine um,
Mhm.
from a physical level, right? But the way it's impacting their physiology and the impact it has on their then menstrual experience is really profound. And all they need is that dot to be connected, those dots to be connected for them to sometimes make a slightly different or healthier choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And you hear like, I skip breakfast. I'm doing virtual school, so I don't really make anything for lunch, but I'm really tired and I have a hard time focusing and I need a nap when I get home from school. Like sometimes you just need that like bigger perspective of like, oh, you're not really eating anything between the hours of 7 in the morning when you wake up. Then you're doing, intense schoolwork, which takes brain power. And then you're eating a whole bag of chips when you get home. Like, yeah, it makes sense. That adds up. I get it. Right? So if we just like paint that picture and approaching nutrition in a way that's like, we're not talking about like tea detoxes. I always talk about like having literacy when it comes to social media and what proper nutrition looks like and what macros are. And carbs, fats, and proteins exist because all three are important. And if anyone tells you to cut one of them out, you need to stop listening to them immediately. And just having someone there to tell you that food's not bad. There's no such thing as good food and bad food. I had a great time over Easter eating all of the treats, but it's important to know that we are what we repeatedly do. And our relationship with food is important. And starting that conversation with young people is like major, so major.
So we've covered some ground here. We've talked about like they need to do some tracking and make sure that they're on par to see that positive trajectory towards what we would consider to be maybe a healthy menstrual cycle, which is that maybe 27 to 31 day, and that's day one is the first day you're bleeding, up to day one, the next day that you're bleeding. I always get those patients who are in their 30s and 40s, and I say, well, how long is your menstrual cycle? And they say 5 days.
5.
We're not talking about the bleeding days. We're talking about all the days. Seeing just that more teen experience of acne and hormonal symptoms versus this aggressive treatment resistant experience, which would maybe point us towards a different diagnosis than just teen acne or teen hormones. We want to have the conversation early and positively without really projecting our own negative experiences of our menstrual history onto our young menstruator. Although I think one of the sort of important areas there is if the mom struggled with treatment resistant acne, irregular cycles, really painful periods,
Mhm.
that information is maybe important to note that may influence your teen's experience,
Totally. Yeah.
right? Because now we're
Mhm.
talking about the genetics around some of our menstrual dysfunction versus
Mhm.
you saying, oh, here comes the curse, right? Like that's not what we want to project onto our young menstruators.
Mhm. It's more the view of your cycle as opposed to like another tool to determine what your trajectory may be. Maybe.
Mm-hmm. There's this cute little study, which I've mentioned multiple times, and I always forget if I've mentioned it on the podcast or not, where they texted women statements about their period before, and they only used women in the study, so that's why I'm using the word woman. They texted women information about their period before it was coming. And half of the women got really positive messages like, here comes is one of your vital signs. Like, isn't it amazing to be a woman? Spend this time to reflect and, on your health and well-being and go girl power. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And the other half of the women got text messages that said things like, oh my God, this is such a disaster. Here comes the curse. Periods are so annoying. And they followed these women for months to see what impact. And the text messages were like anonymous, like they were coming from the research study.
Mm-hmm.
And the women who were given the negative text messages reported that they had more PMS, more headaches, more cramps. Like they overall reported, and the physical symptoms, it's not that they were more irritable because someone was reminding them to be irritable. They legitimately rated their physical symptoms as being more painful and more distressing than the women who had the positive messages, right? And so you can imagine how influential it would be for one of the adults that you live with to hate their period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And then this links to one of my other favorite points about education around menstrual cycles is your period is important for reasons other than fertility, right? Like I think on reflection, I think when you got your period, it's just like, why is this happening? Like, why is this happening to me? And I think inevitably we always got messages of, well, now you are a woman and now you can have babies. And it's like connecting that experience to someone who maybe doesn't, one, connect to the feeling of being a woman, or two, I'm 12 and not interested in having babies. It's like that already, that messaging of like, well, this doesn't make sense for me.
Yeah, the
You
purpose of
already,
this is for someone else.
this isn't for me. Like,
Yeah.
no thanks. Unsubscribe, not for me. And because we're women and we can have babies and you don't connect to that as an 11-year-old, already that messaging about your menstrual cycle is like negative, right? So it's impossible to separate the conversation between menstruation and fertility. And I do think that that's a part of the conversation, but it's an aspect of menstruation. And I don't think it should be reduced to fertility only, right? Especially for our young people. Periods and menstruation are important for so many aspects. It's important for, your bones and your muscles and your mood and your skin and your performance in sports and being creative and learning a musical instrument. Like it's important for all of those aspects. And instead of just being like, well, you have your period now because you can have babies, like let's broaden the scope so that, like the study with the text messaging, just knowing that there's positive aspects to having a menstrual cycle, because there are, will improve our understanding of it and our experience with it.
Mm-hmm. And I think that just builds women and people who are more able to advocate for themselves as they get older. It's not uncommon that I meet a woman in her mid to late 40s where when I start talking about her cycle, she's had challenges with her cycle her whole life, but because she chose not to have children or was not able to have children, her menstrual cycle was not looked at again. And yet it's like deeply connected to her metabolic health and to perhaps her thyroid health and to the way she's going to experience menopause. But because the focus was not on the fertility aspect of her cycle got ignored, right? It was a nuisance that she put up with for how irregular or painful or heavy it was. And it was never really looked at by any of her practitioners seriously until she landed across my desk. Heavy periods as a teen. I just want to make sure that we cover that before I have one more question for you after this. But I did want to cover sort of that, like, what is a heavy period? Because I think that's also a piece of information that people don't know. I think women could say, yeah, if I got up out of my car and I was flooding my pants, or if I had to put towels down while I was sleeping, I would call that heavy.
Mhm.
Although I still treat some women who that has not been considered heavy in their books to be bleeding that much.
Mhm.
But what do we consider to be a heavy period for young people, and what should they be looking out for there?
Yeah, so with periods, it's probably around like that 50 milliliter mark of blood loss. And it's always like, well, how the heck are we going to know what 50 milliliters is? I always like saying that in appointments, mainly just for the
For the
reaction
shock.
of like,
Yeah.
what?
And
It's
and
like,
the patient wants to please you so badly, so they're nodding and they're like, "Okay, I
yes,
guess I better try and figure out how much
better
50
get my
ml."
measuring cup out. And also, it's like, really? It's 50 mils? It feels like 6 liters. Like, what is happening right now? So, starting to track number of tampons or diva cups or menstrual cups tend to have like that gradation on it that will tell you like mils lost, and paying attention to that. Like one soaked regular tampon or pad holds 5 milliliters. And if it's half soaked when you take it out, that's around 2.5. So like, yes, we can get really like specific about like looking at number of pads and tampons, just so like a preteen or even an adult who doesn't really know what a normal amount of blood loss is can understand that. But if you feel like your periods are heavy and flooding, it probably means that your periods are heavy and flooding, and you don't necessarily need to get the measuring cup
Mhm.
out.
Mhm.
But also knowing that with maturing menstrual cycles, we may not see ovulation at every cycle. And when that happens, it does set the stage for potentially heavy bleeds. And knowing that as the cycle starts to mature, we should be having more ovulatory cycles, which should start to lighten the flow as we go. And I'm just super jealous of all of the amazing period products there are now. Like some of those period underwear can hold like 6 tampons worth of blood, which is like so awesome for our like young menstruators, and knowing that they feel like protected. And there's period swimwear if you're not comfortable using tampons. So making sure that you're exploring all the different ways to hold your menstrual blood. But yeah, heavy menstrual cycles is a common experience for the first year or so as the body is learning that communication between brain and ovary to have regular ovulatory cycles.
Mhm. Part of why I want to point this out is that it's not uncommon for us to work with young competitive athletes who one of their primary concerns with their menstrual cycle is the heaviness of it. And so I want parents and teens to be mindful of energy availability for young people, right? So we'll paint the picture: the competitive gymnast who skips breakfast, eats a Baby Bell cheese for lunch, maybe has poutine on Thursdays, and is picky, and so doesn't eat a lot of dinner and trains 2.5 hours 5 days a week for gymnastics, right?
Mhm.
So what that young person has done has created what we call like low energy availability, meaning that they don't eat a lot, or they have periods of time where they eat less, but then maybe periods where they catch up, but their output of energy is really high. And this is a common cause of those anovulatory cycles, or to keep that relationship between their brain and ovaries immature, where we want it to develop and get better over time. Our young competitive athletes have that potential, especially if their calories in versus their energy expenditure is not satisfied, right? Their brain has a hard time making that connection between brain and ovary, and they may end up with these really horrific, heavy periods that could be solved if we looked at them from that nutrition perspective, or if at least we paid attention to what was happening. But if heavy periods are preventing a teen from participating in sport, especially, we need to be looking at that like relationship between their nutrition and how hard they're exercising.
Totally. That your body needs to feel safe in order to ovulate. And I always talk about stress with my young people, especially given the time right now. And I think we can always think of stress as like an argument with our parents or homework or a disagreement with one of our friends. But under eating or over exercising or not sleeping are big stressors on our body, which can prevent the feeling of safety in order to ovulate, which can give us those big, heavy flooding periods for sure. And then
But
getting the iron checked as well.
yes, thank you for throwing that in.
Right?
So important.
Like, oh my goodness. Right. And it's not a regular thing for practitioners to check young people's blood, but sometimes it's really important. Like I didn't get my first set of blood work done until I was 23, right? And I had been like a regular menstruating person for, 10, 11 years. And my iron was like in the toilet and no one thought to like look at it. And the fun part is when you have low iron, that can set the stage for heavy periods. And when you have heavy periods, that sets the stage for low iron. So having a practitioner on your team who's curious about checking those things is important.
I don't think I got blood work done until I was pregnant.
Really?
I don't think so. No, as
Oh,
you were saying
geez.
that, I'm sitting here
Yeah.
going, when did I first have blood work done? I'm pretty
Oh,
sure
geez.
that was it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I was 27. That's
You're
fine.
27. That's
Yeah, I'm
fine.
sure we
That's
didn't
fine.
miss anything in all those years that
Of
I wasn't.
school and stress and
Yeah.
bleeding, it's fine. Not fine. Not
The one
fine.
more question I have for you,
Yeah.
Erin, is like, what do you feel like is the biggest myth surrounding teen menstrual health that you? So I want you to talk about your course. So you've developed an online resource for teens and parents to get better educated. It is so much information, way more than what we would ever achieve in a single one-on-one appointment with a parent and a teen. And it's going to be so great for our community to be able to access this information at home in their jammies at their own pace. But I want you to kind of sort of, before we talk about that, because we're going to talk about that, I want you to walk us through like what do you feel like is the biggest myth or what's the biggest gap in teen menstrual health right now, and how are you going to solve it?
hmm I think the biggest gap is knowing how awesome it is to have a menstrual cycle for the physical body. I think the biggest thing that I just kept coming back to while I was creating the course was that there are benefits to this. And I just want people to understand, and not just, young people who haven't gotten their first period or they're just starting to get their period or they're in their 40s. Like, your menstrual cycle and the hormones it creates have power and meaning and are important. And looking at it as something that is powerful and not based in shame is the most important thing that I want to convey. And I hope that it comes across in how passionately I talk about period power and asking questions and being curious and saying the word vulva out loud and just full transparency. Like, we're not using, funny little words. We're using like the real words. It's age appropriate because it's real. And it's important for them to know. We don't need to be secret about it. It doesn't need to be hush hush. So I think that that's like the biggest thing that I want to convey is that there's power to your menstrual cycle.
That's amazing. And I'm proud of you for creating this resource for our community. So walk us through what the Period Talk course is. And then we'll talk about how listeners can access the information.
Sure. So it's 5 modules, and the modules range from working with your period to when things kind of go sideways to nutrition to how stress and sleep and movement come into the picture. So there's 5 modules spread out over 5 days. There's slides and neat my face and me talking about the slides being recorded. So you get to hear my voice and see my face. But everything's pre-recorded. So you can press play. If you want to go have some lunch, you can press pause, go eat your lunch, come on back. If you're busy one day, you don't have to watch that video that day. I love the idea of it being pre-recorded, and as you said, you can like sit in your jammies and have a cup of tea and watch it. So that's sort of the layout of it, is pre-recorded videos with slides, and accompanying that is I created a 60-page workbook that has review pages, recipes, checklists, all the good stuff in there, and action items as well. So instead of just being like a course where I spew information at you, there's take home items that you can actually put into action to make periods better and more enjoyable, and just live in your fierce awesomeness with those action items. So that's the PDF workbook that you can either print out or keep digital, which I think a lot of young people will do.
They don't have a printer.
I know. Do people not have printers anymore? Using the internet and the Zoom and
Zoom.
such.
We're on the Zoom right now.
We're on the Zoom. And then there's also an opportunity to send me anonymous questions, which I will be recording the answers in video form. And then everyone gets to enjoy the answers to the question. So it's all anonymous. But then the nice part is, if you are wondering, why are my poops really weird when I'm on my period? And then I get to answer it. And if you have that question, 99.9% of every other young person has the same question. So we all get to have the answer. So that's the Ask Me Anything. And I've heard it all. So ask me anything.
I love what you've done with this program, Erin, and partly because it's removing some of the barriers to accessing this kind of care. We know when we work with the parents of these young teens that they're always questioning the value of dragging their teen to an appointment, stuffing them in a chair across from us, and making them talk about their menstrual cycle to us, right? There's always that concern that if that's their first exposure to having this conversation, is it really going to give them the outcome they want? Is it a good use of their resources for them to spend the money and the time in order to do that? And I think what the course does, it actually breaks down a lot of those barriers. So first of all, it makes that first contact and having the conversation safe and at home and together. And so they're learning together, right? And it's like the parent and the teen has the opportunity to connect on this topic together, but you're not doing it in person where we say, well, tell us about your menstrual blood, right? Like it removes that barrier of the embarrassment factor, but it also allows them to access hours of contact with you for a fraction of the cost of what it normally would be for one-on-one care. And what you and I have learned over the last few years, especially with introducing our women's health program, is that everyone has the same questions. And so we might as well stuff y'all in the same room and answer them at the same time. That's what this program is allowing you to do. It's reaching more people to have the same conversation. It's evidence-based, meaning that you're not going to, like, if you look on Google for information, you can find websites that say the sky is purple. This is like medical grade information about teen menstrual health that is going to give the parents and the teens a massive leg up in the way they sort of cruise through these years together. So I'm so grateful that you've put it together for our community and for all of our listeners, because you don't need to be a patient to connect with us through this program, which is amazing. I've got the information that I want to share with the group around how to connect with you in the course, but do you want to leave us with some final lasting words? I tried to just remember what you said about like fierce period awesomeness, and I immediately forgot what you said, but whatever that was, I want you to repeat it.
Thank goodness we're recording this. Because I was going to say, maybe I don't remember what I said. But my hope is that this topic of menstruation will just continue to go down the road of not feeling taboo. And I want it to be like regular vernacular in homes, right? Like I just want it to be part of like the daily experience. And the more you notice your menstrual cycle and the more you track it and the more you have a conversation with, between mom and menstruator, like even through viewing the course together, like opening up avenues of conversation, the more we do that, the more that like that young person who did the course will talk to their friend about it and it will just spread like wildfire. And I hope that the future of period positivity will begin with you and your young menstruator, because I do think that we are so powerful. And imagine how powerful we could be if we were allowed to exist like for real and not be like undercover all the time. Like I think as menstruators, there's so much power there, but we've really been hidden for so long. And I want this to be like a call to action to be like, yep, we're here. We're going to be loud.
50% of the population is going to menstruate at some point in their life. We don't need tampons that have crinkle-free paper on them to hide them in our jean pockets. Right?
Up your sleeve. Yes. So I
one
think
of my greatest
that's
fears, when I was in grade 7, I distinctly remember being pushed on the swing by one of my crushes. And I had these great overalls on with the, overalls have like relatively big pockets, right?
Yes.
And I was getting pushed. It was like the sun was shining. This couldn't have been a more perfect moment. And then 3 of my tampons flew out of my overall pockets and I was on the swing, right? So they had legs behind them, trajectory across I imagine them going miles and all over the playground. I'm sure that they landed like 2 feet away from me. But they're like how mortified I was by that experience. And then I can watch my kids having a conversation about, is my daughter going to grow breasts first or get her period first? The jury's out and they both have a say in what they think is going to happen. I want it to be like that for them, right? I want it to be this like conversation where both my daughter and my son know what's going on. And it's deemed as a superpower and not something that needs to be hidden in your overall pockets.
Yes, totally. Actually, I don't know if we have time for this, but there was a really funny study of women who dropped a tampon out of their purse onto the ground, and men and women thought less of them when they dropped a tampon out of their purse versus when they dropped a hair clip out of their purse. Men and women. Like thought less of those people. So you know what? If you drop a tampon in front of me, it's all good. You menstruate. Shocking. And that's the other thing. TMI, don't want to talk to you about my period. It's like, why is that TMI?
No, this is why you're here, actually. You wrote on your forms. You're here for your period. Yeah.
So let's talk about it. Jeez.
Okay. So I'm going to put all the links for the course, which you can register for in the show notes. But if you want a quick link, it's www.clarityhealthburlington.ca/period talk. That has the registration page on there. I highly recommend that you look into it. You're going to follow Dr. Erin on social media as well. You have a free download there for parents and menstruators that outlines a lot of the things we talked about in today's podcast, but would give you some written materials for what your next move might be with your teen. Thank you so much for joining me today, Erin.
Thank you so much for having me again.
Always a pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. It's my absolute passion to bring women quality and science-informed information about their health so that they can make empowered, good decisions about their health care. I'd like to invite you to join me in my Facebook community, Women's Health Unplugged. There we share live videos, blog posts, and behind-the-scenes information about the podcast where you can connect with me and other women who are interested in their health care. You can find us at facebook.com/groups/WH Unplugged. We'll see you there.